It's an early morning of February 24th, 2022. In the border village of Dniprovsk, Ukrainian 105th Border Detachment soldiers sleep in their barracks, unaware of the approaching storm. A missile from the drone strikes without warning, wounding six and marking the start of the Russia's full-scale invasion. Despite the chaos, the border guards act swiftly, blowing up the mine bridge across the Dnipro River to slow down the enemy's advance. Along the Chernihiv region border, similar scenes unfold. Russian artillery, drones, and aviation hammer all the Ukrainian border checkpoints from both Russia and Belarus. And this is how the battle for northern Ukraine and its key fortress, Chernihiv, begins. However, before delving right into the key events further, let's take a step back to see a glimpse of the pre-war force layout. In early February 2022, the Russian army, alongside Belarus, conducts large-scale military exercises near Ukraine's border. Dubbed Allied Resolve, these drills are presented as defensive actions to strengthen bilateral military ties. However, for Ukraine, already warned of possible full-scale invasion, they appear overtly threatening. In response, Ukraine launches its own exercises, Zametil 2022, mobilizing key forces in the Chernihiv region, including the 1st Tank and 58th Motorized Infantry Brigades under Operational Command North. The only problem is that Russia's concentrated no less than 130,000 troops on the northern Ukrainian border. These are elements of the Russian 5th, 35th, 36th Combined Arms Armies on the territory of Belarus, as well as 41st Combined Arms Army on the territory of Russia. And these forces are concentrated only against Chernihiv region, with the elements of 1st Guards Tank, 2nd Combined Arms, and the 6th Combined Arms Armies deployed against nearby Sumy region. This overwhelming concentration of troops and elite units, fully equipped and fresh from training, will later be described by many as merely a diversion force. However, their true objective is clear: not just to capture regional centers like Chernihiv or Sumy, diverting Ukraine's reserves, but to launch a multilateral strike directly at the heart of Ukraine, Kyiv, and to capture it within days, as anticipated by both Western analysts and the Russian command. A few days before the invasion, the commander of the Operational Command North, Viktor Nikolyuk, checks the readiness of the troops in the Chernihiv region and gives a number of secret orders about the organization of the region's defense. Colonel Dmytro Brzezinski, commander of the Chernihiv's defense staff, who in the past commanded one of the most elite Ukrainian brigades, 93rd Mechanized, remains in charge in the city of Chernihiv, while Nikolyuk travels further to Konotop. Unlike other military officials, Brzezinski thinks that it's more likely that the escalation of the ongoing war in Donbass will happen only in the east, and since it's pretty much only two brigades that are left to defend one of the most strategically important cities in northern Ukraine, he was not the only one who thought this way. Coming back to the beginning of invasion of the north, at 6:20 am, Russian forces launched cruise missiles at the key Ukrainian military infrastructure, targeting air bases in Chernihiv, Nizhyn, and the 1st Tank Brigade training center in Goncharivske. One missile hits its mark, destroying a radar at Chernihiv airport, but the others strike empty barracks and warehouses. This is due to a critical decision of Viktor Nikolyuk, who had earlier ordered the 1st Tank and 58th Motorized Infantry Brigades to disperse across the region to minimize casualties from initial missile and artillery strikes. While this strategy saves the most important thing, lives, it increases the pressure on commanders to maintain control of their units and makes holding the border impossible. Yet, officers like Leonid Hoda, commander of the 1st Tank Brigade, rise to the challenge. On the morning of February 24th, he briefly calls his wife to say goodbye before heading to a newly established forward command post, fully aware of the immense task ahead. Meanwhile, around 15,000 Russian soldiers, supported by the thousands of pieces of equipment, break through Ukraine's border from Belarus. Near the villages of Skytok and Sinkivka, the 38th and 35th Motor Rifle Brigades push forward in armored columns, advancing along highways towards Lipki and Horodnya. To the west of Chernihiv, the 64th Rifle Brigade reaches the outskirts of Mikhailo Kotyubinsky, positioning Russian forces to attack the city from three sides. Similar movements unfold east of Chernihiv, where the half of the 90th Tank Division advances along the highway through Semenivka and Novgorod-Siversky, supported by the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade. Meanwhile, the 55th Brigade and another half of the 90th Tank Division advanced in the nearby Sumy region. In this video, our focus remains on Chernihiv, so we will only briefly address battles in Sumy region, as they deserve a separate, detailed analysis. After breaching the border, Russian forces rapidly advanced, cutting through Ukrainian territory along highways, flanked by dense forests. For the Ukrainians, despite having half the troops and up to 10 times less equipment, the strategy is clear: hold Chernihiv at all costs. If the city falls, the Russians would gain a secure crossing over the Desna River and a direct route along the M01 highway to Kyiv, using the key city as a logistical hub. With their western flank shielded by the Desna River, they could transport and supply large forces to either storm or lay siege to the portion of Kyiv on the left bank of the Dnipro River. This was a key part of almost flawless plan, one that was ultimately destined to fail. The initial Ukrainian plan was to concentrate forces along the Rybki-Horodnya line, aiming to hold the Russians before they could leave the narrow, forested highways and advance into the open areas of the central Chernihiv region. However, Leonid Hoda, commander of the 1st Tank Brigade, quickly adapts, recognizing that his forces would be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Russian armor, which includes multiple brigades and an entire tank division. Instead of establishing a rigid defensive line, Hoda decides to let Russian columns advance deeper all the way to the city's outskirts. There, his forces can execute hit-and-run attacks on flanks using small, highly mobile units that can leverage their knowledge of the terrain. This approach allows to tie down the enemy, leaving large mechanized columns vulnerable to concentrated artillery strikes. On the evening of February 24th, the first direct engagement happens as the reconnaissance force of the Russian 74th Motor Rifle Brigade gets ambushed in the area of Rivnopilya, just a few kilometers from Chernihiv. After the initial infantry ambush, 2 Ukrainian BMPs and tanks rushed to clear the area, capturing Russian BMP-2 and Tiger infantry mobility vehicles, which were simply abandoned. 2 BMPs, 4 Tigers, as well as a number of supply trucks are destroyed right on the road. Ukrainians also captured the commander of the reconnaissance platoon of the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade during these clashes. On February 25th, the day begins with Russian forces officially declaring that Chernihiv is fully encircled, claiming that the Ukrainian armed forces are not resisting and that the Russian military has suffered no losses. However, during this broadcast, another Russian column near Chernihiv is obliterated near Horodnya by Tochka-U ballistic missiles. Over 20 pieces of various equipment are destroyed and more than 100 Russian soldiers are killed. In response, the Russian command tells their subordinates that the destroyed equipment near Chernihiv actually belongs to Ukrainians. Unaware of the reality, another column of over 50 armored vehicles attempts to enter the city. This time, Ukrainians set up an ambush with tanks and BMPs near Khalyavin, successfully halting the column and destroying 2 tanks that block the road. Once the column is stopped, Ukrainian artillery opens fire, crippling the Russian attack. The ambush force retreats back to the city, only to be ambushed themselves by the Russian forces advancing from the west. From this direction, the 64th Motor Rifle Brigade also tries to enter Chernihiv, but is stopped by the Territorial Defense Forces. Currently, these are lightly armed volunteers who, by hundreds, join the soldiers of the 1st Tank Brigade to stop the Russians after the mayor of the city, Vladislav Atroshenko, calls on citizens to take arms and defend Chernihiv. The 72nd National Guard Battalion and 27th National Guard Regiment, as well as border guards, arrive in Chernihiv to assist the defenders. At this point, Ukrainians lost 6 men and 3 vehicles, but prevented Russians from entering the city. The battles also raged for Chernihiv airport, defended by conscripts, a few tanks of the 1st Tank Brigade, and National Guardsmen. Ukrainians fear the helicopter assault, just like in Hostomel, but instead face another Russian mechanized column. They immediately take out 4 adversary tanks on the road by an accurate fire of Ukrainian armor concealed in the airport area. When Russians panic and start dispersing under fire, their vehicles try to drive across the field and immediately get stuck in deep mud. This is how yet another attack on Chernihiv fails. By the end of the second day, Russian forces consolidate their positions in Rivnopilya, Khalyavin, and Mikhailo Kotyubinske. Russian aviation, which has provided little support during the initial advance, begins bombing the Chernihiv as well. Meanwhile, around 1,500 men volunteered to join 119th Territorial Defense Brigade in the city, forming a lightly armed but highly motivated fighting force that patrols city streets with the 134th Security and Support Battalion and fills the gaps in defense wherever necessary. The rest of the city's residents prepare for urban combat, making Molotov cocktails and barricading the streets under constant airstrikes. In nearby towns like Bakhmach, Koryukivka, and Horodnya, civilians block the roads to hinder Russian vehicles. Many residents in surrounding villages record and send photos, videos, and other information to the Ukrainian armed forces, significantly improving the defenders' situational awareness. Meanwhile, Russian troops grow disoriented, facing unexpected resistance in areas they anticipated to capture quickly, while finding themselves in locations they weren't supposed to be. The deliberate removal of town signs by civilians only adds to their confusion. In one incident, 2 stranded Russian tanks and their crews inexplicably drowned in the Desna River in Maksaki, although the Russian Grouping of Forces Center, commanded by Colonel General Alexander Lapin, begins to stretch thin, they remain a formidable threat to the defenders. Despite losing direction and becoming bogged down in fields and random villages, they have not suffered critical losses and do not retreat from any captured areas. Moreover, they also begin to inflict losses on Ukrainians, whose hit-and-run tank attacks with minimal support do not always succeed. On the third day of the invasion, Russian forces launch a new attack on Chernihiv, breaking into the village of Tovstolis after suppressing a lone Ukrainian checkpoint. The village defenders manage to destroy command and control vehicles, as well as Russian tanks, but are eventually overwhelmed. Ukrainian command, exhausted at this point, does not respond quickly enough. A column of tanks and BMPs from the 35th Motor Rifle Brigade, led by the vehicle of battalion commander Leonid Shotkin, enters the northern part of the city and moves towards Epicenter, a large home improvement store. Shotkin's tank, which drives far ahead of the main force, randomly firing at civilian buildings, is ambushed by just 2 soldiers from the 1st Tank Brigade, Artur Oriferenko and Maxim Borisenko. The third RPG grenade hits the tank's track, immobilizing it. As the tank turns, exposing the thin side armor, the Ukrainians strike the engine, setting the vehicle ablaze. 2 out of 3 crew members, Leonid Shotkin and Mikhail Kulikov, abandon the tank and surrender. In the meantime, Maxim Borisenko damages another tank with grenade launcher, while the main Russian force, parked near high-rise buildings, begins to suspect something is wrong. Unable to contact their missing battalion commander, they quickly begin withdrawal from the city streets. Ukrainian tanks and territorial defense forces arrive to assist the handful of soldiers who had just driven off the entire Russian column of 7 tanks and 7 BMPs and captured its commander. In brief combat, the Ukrainians capture an intact Russian tank, BMP, and 1 command and control vehicle, forcing the remaining Russian forces to retreat from the city perimeter. On February 27th, enraged by yet another failure to capture Chernihiv, Russian forces retaliate by launching a cruise missile strike at Ukrainian positions near Epicenter. This marks the beginning of the sustained artillery bombardment, during which the chief sergeant of the 1st Tank Brigade, Oleksiy Senyuk, is killed. Senyuk, who had captured a Russian T-72 a day before, will be posthumously awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine. The second experienced tanker of the 1st Tank Brigade, Senior Lieutenant Maxim Belokony, who had already destroyed 2 Russian tanks so far, is killed by the group of Russian saboteurs who used civilian vehicles to infiltrate Chernihiv. He will be also posthumously awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine. After this incident, civilians, especially those with hunting rifles, begin to patrol the city streets to prevent the infiltration of Russians in disguise. The following day, February 28th, Russian forces intensify their artillery strikes, indiscriminately targeting civilian infrastructure and completely destroying the epicenter building. To the south of Chernihiv, battles also envelop multiple villages and road crossings. On February 27th, in the village of Milki, the Ukrainian 54th Reconnaissance Battalion sets up an ambush against a massive Russian column advancing towards Kyiv from the Sumy region. This column, numbering in the hundreds of vehicles, had faced little resistance up until this point, and the Russian forces, confident in their progress, focused solely on reaching the capital. The column, led by elite 1st Tank Regiment of the 2nd Motor Rifle Division, is halted by a group of up to 50 volunteers, and soldiers from the 51st Battalion on a bridge. While the lightly armed volunteers provide suppressive fire, the Corsair ATGM crew destroys a Russian tank attempting to cross the bridge. In retaliation, a Russian tank destroys 4 Ukrainian trucks, preventing the defenders from quickly resupplying with anti-tank missiles. Despite this setback, the defenders suffer only one casualty, a wounded volunteer commander, and continue their assault, destroying a second Russian tank with ATGM. Shocked by unexpected resistance, the Russian forces likely overestimate the scale and the strength of the Ukrainian defenders. They begin a rushed retreat, abandoning an intact tank that becomes stuck in the mud while trying to turn around. The Ukrainian defenders, now low on munitions, retreat as well, but call in close air support. Ukrainian Su-25, flying low, launches rockets at the retreating Russian column, further destroying Bairam-1 reconnaissance vehicle and 2 supply trucks. This severely damages a morale of Russia's most elite tank regiment, forcing them to abandon 4 more intact tanks as their retreat turns into a rout. Behind them, another piece of a long Russian column intended to deliver ammunition and fuel to the tanks also comes under attack by a group of Ukrainian volunteers from Sribne. They destroyed 2 of the leading trucks with Molotov cocktails and captured almost all the remaining vehicles from fleeing Russians. During this attack, Ukrainians also captured 1 OSA air defense system and another tank. The abandoned Russian equipment continues to accumulate, and the OSA system, now in Ukrainian hands, will soon begin its service in Ukraine's air defense, providing additional protection over Kyiv's skies. This is just one example of how volunteer groups and a single battalion from Prylukhy organize ambushes throughout the southern Chernihiv region, slowing down the Russian advance towards Kyiv. As detailing every such ambush in northern Ukraine would take hours, we now return to the key city of Chernihiv. On February 28th, elements of the Russian 74th and 35th Brigades bypassed Chernihiv, advancing along M01 highway and linking up with the 64th Motor Rifle Brigade, which has successfully captured Mikhailo Kotyubinske. Their new objective is to cross the river to the south of the city and completely cut off the defenders of Chernihiv from the rest of the country. To achieve this, they concentrate forces for a massive assault on the village of Kryinka. Ukrainian command quickly realizes how dangerous the situation is and deploys a large portion of their already scarce resources to defend Kryinka, including even the Chernihiv police. The village comes under relentless artillery bombardment, but the Ukrainian forces establish stable positions in the nearby forest, near a key highway intersection, preparing for the Russian armored push. This defensive position is nicknamed Sparta due to the extreme conditions the soldiers face, combating not only the overwhelming Russian forces, but also the harsh temperatures and brutal environment. With limited armament, just 4 RPGs, extra grenades and assault rifles, the Ukrainian soldiers brace for the assault. As the Russian forces approach, the Ukrainians begin to actively engage, firing from the forest and occasionally supported by a few tanks from the 1st Tank Brigade that passes through this sector. This creates an impression that the area is heavily fortified with Ukrainian troops, causing uncertainty among the Russian forces. In response, they intensify their artillery strikes on the forest and even deploy the aviation against the small defense force. Despite this, the Ukrainians continue to hold their positions, suffering significant losses but successfully preventing the Russians from gaining full control of the area. This forces attackers to change plans again as they come back to Mikhailo Kotyubinske just to bypass Ukrainian positions in Kryinka. Russian 40th Engineering and Sapper Regiment, meanwhile, arrives on the bank of the Desna River and begins to build a pontoon bridge when it's hit by Ukrainian .U ballistic missile. In the strike, the chief of staff of the unit, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Kornik, and 8 other soldiers are killed. In a few hours, the main columns swiftly enter Shostovitsa, where Russian vanguard forces continue to build pontoon bridges across the Desna River to both completely encircle Chernihiv and continue the march to Kyiv. Despite the active work of the Ukrainian artillery and by some accounts even aviation, Russians finally establish a pontoon bridge across Desna and transport a sizable force of a newly arrived and fresh 55th Motor Rifle Brigade to the other bank. Ukrainians launch .U tactical ballistic missiles at the river crossings, as well as actively use artillery, but Russians continue rebuilding bridges and crossing the natural defensive barrier. To the east of Chernihiv, they are less lucky, as Ukrainian artillery destroys the river crossing in Makoshono, where the 58th Brigade resists doggedly to halt the Russian advance. Coming back to Shastovitsa, Russians try to hide their forces on the territory of the local airfield, but once again, likely due to the assistance of locals, Ukrainians find and destroy this hideout. Despite that, by March 3rd, Russians enter Yahidne, Zolotinka, and Ladenka, cutting one of the key Ukrainian supply lines. Now, Chernihiv's last line of communication goes through Lukashivka and Kolychivka, which become next targets. Particularly in Yahidne, Ukrainians once again rush to make a fighting force out of anyone available in the area, as Major General Viktor Nikolyuk, commander of the Operational Command North, personally leads soldiers of the 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade to contest the village. As a result of heavy fighting, Ukrainians destroy numerous Russian vehicles and tie down forces long enough for artillery to start pounding adversary positions. Russians also bring their artillery closer, trying to destroy Ukrainians on the village outskirts. Eventually, overnight, they conduct the airstrike on the checkpoint that Ukrainians hold, so defenders are forced to retreat from the village. From this point, Yahidne becomes a temporary command post for the Russian 55th Motor Rifle Brigade. They set up a rare satellite communication station and an air defense reconnaissance and command vehicle here, both of which will later be destroyed. However, the most significant development is that the Russian headquarters is established in the local school, and the basement is used to imprison 366 civilian residents, including 77 children, for 28 days until the area is liberated by Ukrainian troops. The civilians are locked in the basement without access to sewage, light, food, or ventilation, leading to the deaths of 10 of those held captive. Additionally, 17 more people are publicly executed by Russian soldiers. The brutal treatment serves a grim purpose to prevent Ukrainian artillery or aviation from targeting the Russian headquarters. This situation mirrors the horrors that unfold in towns like Bucha, Irpin, and Hostomel on the right bank of the Dnipro River, where Russian forces also advanced towards Kiev. We covered all the events dedicated to the Russian advance on the capital from the east in 2 separate videos, but here it's crucial to note that through the southern Chernihiv region, particularly near Nizhyn, which is defended by a small garrison of the 1st Tank Brigade, the Russians continue their push towards the capital, further deteriorating the position of the Chernihiv defenders. This is how the elements of the 90th Guards Tank Division reach Yahidne as well. However, this does not mean that Chernihiv is fully encircled. In many areas, marked as red on the map, the Russians only loosely control the roads, and their positions are not solidified. They lack a significant number of troops and equipment in these zones. Furthermore, Ukrainians still have access to a dense network of smaller roads, which allow them to maintain minimal logistics and keep vital supplies flowing. On the next day, heavy combat begins for Ivanivka, where again, elements of the 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade face the 55th Russian Motor Rifle Brigade. By March 7th, Ukrainians retreat to Kolychivka, the town through which the last supply route for Chernihiv lies. The area is strengthened with the National Guardsmen and the 3rd Company of the newly formed 21st Separate Rifle Battalion, which due to critical situation has to hold Novoselivka with the 1st and Lukashivka with the 2nd Company, essentially covering the whole eastern flank of Chernihiv, with a handful of troops made out mostly of volunteers without prior combat experience. After relentless artillery bombardment, the Russian mechanized column, this time of 228th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment of the elite 90th Tank Division, enters Kolychivka right through the main road. The situation is beyond critical, as Ukrainians have only a few tanks of the 58th Brigade and a handful of light infantry for village defense against Russian BMPs, tanks and BTRs. However, Major General Viktor Nikolyuk once again arrives at positions in a critical moment. Under his command, Ukrainian troops, including Colonel Dmytro Brzezinski, commander of the Chernihiv Defense Staff, destroy Russian BTR-82A, two T-72Bs, and BMP-2 full of Russian troops, as well as capture another BTR-82A and T-72A, repelling the attack and forcing remaining Russian forces to retreat. On the morning of March 9th, without relieving pressure on Kolychivka, Russians make an unexpected maneuver, swiftly entering Lukashivka, where elements of the 58th Brigade and the 2nd Company of the 21st Rifle Battalion hold the defense. This time, having 30 tanks and 60 BMPs against 2 Ukrainian tanks, Russians push into the village from 3 sides, essentially encircling the defenders. Outnumbered and outgunned, Ukrainian forces managed to break out of the encirclement, retreating to the nearby village while destroying several Russian vehicles in the process. Ukrainian artillery launches a heavy bombardment against the Russian troops from the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade, temporarily halting their pursuit. Ukrainians also placed the ATGM teams in the area to make sure that once Russian vehicles try to cross the key route, they will be destroyed. Still, the road is extremely dangerous, so it's hardly used for logistics, which makes Russians believe that despite all the losses and difficulties, they still have a chance to capture Chernihiv. Looking at the strategic picture, as of March 10th, Russians control the largest percentage of the Ukraine's area in the war, namely 23%. From the west of the capital, they effectively cut out the E40 highway that joins Kyiv to the western part of the country. From the east, Russian columns from Sumy and Chernihiv regions, after infiltrating between heavily defended Nizhyn and Ichnya, cut the M01 highway by controlling Kozalets and Bogdanivka. Chernihiv is almost cut out of supplies, but even if it wasn't, Ukrainians currently do not possess any spare forces or equipment to somehow relieve the besieged northern fortress. Nevertheless, Chernihiv still ties up multiple Russian brigades, while Ukrainian artillery frequently targets Russian mechanized units attempting to bypass the city in their march towards Kyiv. Russian columns are being decimated in towns like Khvylivka, Doroginka, Aivoron, and Velika Doroga, south of Chernihiv, indicating that the Russian forces are in a rush to get to Kyiv instead of capturing strategically important towns that could secure reliable logistics. This situation mirrors the northern Kyiv region, where Russian supply lines suffer from overextension and continued Ukrainian ambushes. Defenders also capture their first major trophies, which include dozens of tanks, which significantly boosts morale. Another factor contributing to the Russian setbacks is the swift organization of civilian resistance. In numerous small towns, locals quickly build barricades, prepare Molotov cocktails, and set up positions, making it easier for Ukrainian small mobile units to defend key locations. One such example is the 54th Reconnaissance Battalion efforts in the city of Preluki, where they combine forces with lightly armed locals and use their knowledge of terrain. The emergence of such resistance units throughout various towns further convinces the Russians that bypassing inhabited areas and rushing towards Kyiv is the best option, a decision that will come back to haunt them later. Since March 3rd, the Russians have fully embraced the new strategy to capture Chernihiv, described simply as if you did not manage to take the objective fast, destroy it completely and capture its smoldering ruins. From this point onwards, Chernihiv is not just pounded by artillery, entire districts are leveled down. Aircraft bombs are used in mass to destroy incredibly important military targets, such as schools, pharmacies, libraries, stadiums, and residential buildings. Russian Su-34s, in the absence of Ukrainian aircraft, which are busy defending Kyiv, fly low and slow, relentlessly dropping bombs on building after building. However, not for long. 2 days after the March 3rd bombardment that killed 47 civilians, Sergei Chizhikov, a post officer worker who had volunteered to join the military, shoots down a Russian Su-34 with an Iglam and pads. The plane crashes in the city, and one of the crew members, pilot Alexander Krasnoyartsev, survives. In his attempt to escape, Krasnoyartsev kills one local civilian, but is eventually captured by Ukrainian forces. On the same day, another Su-34 is shot down by the soldiers of the 58th Brigade, south of Chernihiv, killing both pilots. Ukrainians suffer a loss of their own when the MiG-29 from the 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade is shot down by a missile fired from the Russian MiG-31 near Novobasany, though the pilot ejects safely. While both sides report additional aircraft losses, photographic evidence only exists for these 3 incidents mentioned above. Despite these losses, the Russians continue their bombardments, though by mid-March they are forced to reduce their airstrikes and no longer fly that low. The city of Chernihiv is without water, electricity, or cell service. Ukrainian artillery engages in constant duels with Russian artillery, particularly from the 120th, 385th Artillery Brigades and the 400th Artillery Regiment of the 90th Tank Division, but Ukrainians are at a severe disadvantage due to lack of guns and ammunition needed to suppress the Russian fire. The highest losses for Ukrainians from artillery are sustained in the area of Novoselivka, where the 1st Company of the 21st Rifle Battalion, along with auxiliary forces, controls the village on the high ground and prevents Russian armor from advancing into Chernihiv. On March 16th, the Russians launched a renewed assault on Chernihiv from this direction. Using Spetsnaz forces and a barrage of bombs, along with 6 tanks, the Russians managed to push Ukrainians back slightly, taking out 1 BMP, but failing to fully destroy 40 defenders who retreat to the city perimeter. The Spetsnaz also carry out small raids and ambushes in the northern and western parts of the city, clashing with the 105th Border Detachment in the surrounding forests. On March 22nd, noticing that the Ukrainians have reinforced the Novoselivka direction with elements of the 1st Tank Brigade, the Russians shift their focus and strike near the skiing base front of Stolis. They attack in columns of BMPs and Tigers, advancing rapidly with artillery support. Ukrainians from the 1st Tank Brigade and the 130th Force Security and Support Battalion hold out in the ruins of the base, but after exhausting their limited ammunition supplies, they begin to retreat. Just as this happens, reinforcements arrive, turning the tide and forcing the Russians to pull back after one of their BMPs is immobilized. Simultaneously, Russian infantry attacks in the cemetery area are repelled. Frustrated by the defiance of Chernihiv defenders, who ferociously fight despite being encircled, deprived of supplies, and relentlessly bombarded, the Russians decide to destroy a key bridge leading to the city. On March 23rd, Russian Su-34s drop 6 bombs on the road bridge across the Desna River, collapsing it into water. The footbridge becomes the next target, with artillery used to damage it beyond repair by March 25th. This leaves a majority of city's defenders, as well as 120,000 civilians, cut off from the rest of Ukraine. Defenders quickly adapt by bringing some supplies with boats, but what matters the most is that Chernihiv garrison and regular citizens alike demonstrate unbroken resolve in the face of new challenges. This is something that neither quantity of Russian troops and vehicles nor the fierceness of bombardments could not break. This further erodes Russian morale, as only a handful of forces hold them on the city outskirts for months, even though, according to the initial plan, Chernihiv had to be taken in day or 2. This prompts troops to seek ways to get a foothold in nearby towns and look for convenient ways to retreat if things are not going to change radically. On March 23rd, Russians, likely trying to secure an additional retreat path, tried to persuade the defenders of still unoccupied, but cut out from the rest of the towns, the city of Slavutych to surrender. Located in the dense forest, Slavutych, just like many other towns in the Chernihiv region, formed its own lightly armed territorial defense battalion, while staying completely cut out from the Ukrainian armed forces and all kinds of supplies. The Russians issue an ultimatum to the citizens to surrender and allow them to enter the town without a fight. After receiving a defiant response, similar to one the Moskva cruiser received from the defenders of the Snake Island, the Russians begin shelling of the Ukrainian checkpoint with mortars. Soon after the Russian tank assault, overwhelmed defenders retreat back to the city. However, the Russians issue a second ultimatum. Either approximately 200 defenders leave the town, or all civilian infrastructure of Slavutych will be targeted by Russian MLRS, which will result in mass casualties among the 15,000 residents. The city's defenders decide to retreat to nearby forests. On March 25th, the Russians capture Slavutych, making at least some short-lived victory in the region, while Chernihiv continues to stand free. On March 26th, over one-third of Slavutych population, around 6,000 people, gather at the main city square to protest the occupation. Russian troops respond by shooting in the air and deploying tear gas grenades, trying to intimidate the protesters. However, instead of retreating, thousands of Slavutych residents march directly towards the Russian forces, armed only with the chant, "Go home."
Давай домой! Вас здесь не ждали! Домой давай, шуруй!
Shocked by the sheer number of civilians taking to the streets without any weapons to prevent the city from falling into enemy hands, the Russian troops begin to back down. This is another quite miraculous battle that the Ukrainians win, this time not through weapons, but through, without exaggeration, sheer will and bravery of common people. On that day, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky starts his address to the nation with the following words.
Вільний Славутиче, який загарбникам не підкорити. Сьогодні ми були всі разом з тобою на твоїх вулицях, у твоєму протесті. І всі разом говорили окупантам одне: йдіть додому, поки ще можете ходити. Російські загарбники увійшли в Славутич і зустріли там таку ж реакцію, як і на півдні нашої держави, як і на сході нашої країни. Україна єдина у прагненні жити вільно, жити незалежно і заради власних мрій, а не чужих хворих фантазій. Кожен день нашої боротьби за Україну, за нашу державу, кожен прояв нашого спротиву в усіх районах, куди окупанти зайшли, поки що доводять, що Україна – це сповнена життям держава, яка має історичне коріння і моральну основу на всій своїй території.
As a month has passed since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, several key developments become clear in the northern Ukraine. Firstly, Ukrainian forces, through enormous effort, has managed to stabilize critical parts of the front line. Despite Russia's rapid advance towards Kyiv, they failed to capture key regional centers, such as Sumy and Chernihiv, and most crucially, even enter the capital. The Russian push through Sumy region with elite forces did not result in solid control of strategic towns like Rovny, Konotop, Nizhyn and Priluki. After being pushed back on the eastern outskirts of Kyiv, the Russian forces now attempting to lay siege to the city face the challenge of supplying their troops across 400 kilometers of poorly controlled roads. Every supply convoy becomes vulnerable to ambush, not just from Ukrainian military units, but also from civilians participating in resistance. Taking advantage of this vulnerability, Ukrainian forces launch a number of devastating counterattacks. A part of the 1st Tank Brigade strengthened its hold on Nizhyn, while the 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade does the same in Priluki. This positioning allows for convergent strikes that can effectively isolate Russian forces to the east of Kyiv. Ukrainians also begin counteroffensive operations towards Novobasan, liberating several towns such as Lukashi, Lukyanivka and Novodimarka by March 24th. By March 28th, the counteroffensive picks up momentum on the western flank, with Makarev, Motyzhin and Irpin also liberated, signaling the potential for cutting off Russian forces on the right bank of the Dnipro River. These successes mark a rapid turnaround. Ukrainians, once on defensive, now swiftly counterattack, putting pressure on overstretched and exhausted Russians. After suffering heavy casualties in grueling combat, the invading force on the both banks of Dnipro River is no longer capable of fighting effectively. To prevent inevitable and catastrophic collapse, Russia announces the withdrawal of its forces from the Chernihiv, Sumy and Kyiv regions on March 29th, framing it as a gesture of goodwill. In a matter of next 4 days, Russians swiftly abandon their positions and retreat towards Belarus. The official reason for the retreat was negotiations in Istanbul, where some agreement was reached. However, the agreement was never presented to the public by Russians, while the Ukrainian side completely denies its existence, which makes the version about completely voluntary withdrawal absolutely groundless and useful only for propaganda purposes. In reality, Russians actually made quite rational choice between waiting for catastrophe to envelop all their troops in the northern Ukraine, or cutting losses short and backing down until they could. The execution of this retreat is far from flawless. Russian forces not only abandon their positions, but also leave behind a significant amount of hardware. Ukrainian forces seize over 265 pieces of intact equipment, including tanks, armored vehicles, and air defense systems, many of which have either run out of fuel, ammunition, or were stuck in muddy fields. The most valuable captures include the Buk and Tor air defense missile systems. In the Chernihiv region alone, photographic evidence confirms the total losses of 683 pieces of Russian military equipment, compared to just 52 Ukrainian losses. This completely breaks another popular but false narrative, the idea that the attack in northern Ukraine was a successful diversion. If you lose hundreds of elite troops and the amount of equipment equivalent to an army of an average mid-sized European country, for no gain whatsoever, it's not a diversion. It's more likely that you simply failed, as the commander of the Russian Central Military District, Colonel General Alexander Lapin, did, after he was put in charge of the operation to capture Chernihiv. It's his first, but not last military disaster, as Lapin's unthinkable incompetence is matched only by his incredible resilience that allows him to stay in command of the whole armies and fronts throughout the war, despite repeated failures. Moreover, on March 30th, immediately following the Russian retreat from Chernihiv, Lapin tarnishes his reputation even more. He personally awards the Order of Courage to his son, Denis Lapin, the commander of the 1st Guards Tank Regiment. This act, occurring in the wake of a failed campaign that left Russian forces in retreat, is emblematic of misplaced priorities and undisguised nepotism within the Russian military command structure. In conclusion, the initial resistance of Chernihiv's defenders played a crucial role in saving Kyiv by halting the significant Russian forces advancing on the left bank of the Dnipro River. Later, the success of the battle for Kyiv proved pivotal in turning the tide for Chernihiv. As Ukrainian forces pushed the Russians back from the capital, they disrupted the invaders' plans, forcing a large-scale retreat and providing relief to the besieged northern stronghold. The defense of Chernihiv also highlights the exceptional personal courage and strategic brilliance of Major General Viktor Nikolyuk, commander of the Ukrainian Operational Command North. It was Nikolyuk who devised an effective strategy to defend the city against overwhelming Russian forces with extremely limited troops. It's also worth noting his participation in direct assaults as an example of extreme bravery. We would usually criticize such an approach, but in a situation of extreme shortage of troops and involvement of hundreds of volunteers in the battle, it was ultimately a heroic decision. Ironically, Nikolyuk will later face his vis-a-vis from Chernihiv battle, Alexander Lapin, in another pivotal encounter during the summer 2022. Nikolyuk commanded the Ukrainian troops that obliterated Russian forces attempting to cross the Siversky Donets River near Bilogorivka. That operation ended in disaster for the Russians, resulting in the destruction of up to 1,000 men from the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade and 73 armored vehicles. This failed crossing, emblematic of the Russian operational missteps, was also the result of the Alexander Lapin's borderline comical incompetence. We covered this in our Battle for Severodonetsk video. Overall, the defense of Chernihiv showcased exceptional coordination between the local government, civilians, and armed forces. This united effort turned the city into a fortress and inflicted severe losses on the Russian forces in both manpower and equipment, ensuring the failure of their objectives. However, the victory came at a steep cost. Ukrainian losses were significant, with estimated of up to 700 civilians and military personnel killed. The 1st Tank Brigade, instrumental in the defense, required extensive replenishment before returning to the front lines as an effective unit. Additionally, Chernihiv bore the scars of the battle, with 70% of the city reduced to ruins after the brutal fire that spanned 1 month, 1 week, and 1 day. Despite the devastation, the city's resilience became a symbol of Ukraine's defiance and determination that, in the end, saved not only the capital, but Ukraine as a whole.